So let's take a look at the pattern and try to abstract it a little bit, and I'll draw you some pictures. The concept here is that we have some kind of interface with some method on it, or maybe multiple methods, but I'm just going to create one called M. Unlike most of the other patterns where we've been trying to hide something from the client or make things easier from the client, this pattern has nothing to do with the actual relationship to the client. It's more of an internal refactoring pattern. So like we had in the example that I showed you in code, let's assume that we have a couple of implementations of this interface. Let's say implementation A and implementation B, and they both implement the method M. And what often happens in an application like this is that when we studied the implementation of M in various implementations, we find that the implementations are very similar. So in this pattern, what we're trying to do is we're trying to make it easier for developers to create new implementations of the interface. And the way we will do that is that we will try to take the algorithm, analyze it, and try to figure out what's common across the various implementations. So perhaps we look into the method of implementation B and we see that it has a set of steps. And we could probably analyze those set of steps and maybe even build some kind of flowchart. So say, for instance, that we analyze it and we find that this algorithm has three phases. There is a setup phase, there is something very unique to implementation B, I'll just call it doX, and then there is a teardown phase. We may not see it immediately, but it's when we're studying the various implementations that we will see some kind of algorithmic pattern. Perhaps when we study implementation A, we see that we do the same setup, we do the same teardown, but instead of doing X, we do, say, Y. When I created the code example, that manifested itself by the fact that I had to copy and paste code from one class to the other. This is a very typical indication that a template method might be a good way to go. We need a place to implement the commonality between the various implementations, so we introduced an abstract class that implementation A and B in this example would inherit from. That implements the interface that the client expects. And now it's a matter of taking the algorithm for the method M, take it from one of the classes, and lift it up into this abstract implementation. In this trivial example, the setup and the teardown can remain in the abstract implementation. However, the doX has to be wiped out. We have to do something to invoke the subclasses at that point. What we're doing then is we're ensuring that setup occur before teardown, but we can't do whatever is in the middle in this example because it has to be done differently for the various subclasses. So what we'll have to do is we have to, from within the implementation of M on the abstract implementation, call some method that we introduced on the abstract implementation, say doIt. It's typically protected because we don't want the client to be influenced by this. This has nothing to do with the interface to the client, but it would be something that the subclasses perhaps must or can implement. We can now change the various concrete subclasses, here implementation A and B, and just introduce the doIt method. So they will not be responsible for the setup or the teardown. All they have to do is to implement some plugin method, that's why we call it a template method, that will be called from the base class. Now, some people have called this the Hollywood way of doing object-oriented design. Don't call us, we call you. So in this case, it's the framework calling the application code in many cases. A more common way is, of course, that the applications have been using libraries from the framework. I would also like to throw out a little bit of a warning here. I've certainly seen a lot of framework overusing this pattern. Overusing it to a point where it becomes very, very difficult for their client, being the ones writing the subclasses, to use the framework. Often there are so many methods that could be implemented or could be overridden, or some that must. And often they have rules where if you override this method, you must call this superclass method before you do something, and it becomes very complicated. There are several famous companies that come up with some framework based entirely on this principle that has been a total tragedy.